Okay.
Thank you, robot voice. Now, do we have participants? Let me check this. We have 10 participants so far. 11, and they're coming in. So I'll give people 30 seconds or so, and then I'll start. Okay, let's just start. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm David Mills. I'm a new NSWA board member this year, and the Northwest Science Writers Association is, if you don't know, a lively and mutually supportive group of science communicators in a variety of media. And panels like tonight are just one of the ways that members get together to explore different aspects of the work of communicating about science. Check out the website, nwscience.org. I'll put it in the chat. You can find recordings of our recent events and information about publications by members recently, and also keep track of upcoming events, including an in-person outdoor happy hour in July. You definitely want to keep track of that. And if you're not a member, please think about becoming one. I think it's particularly appropriate tonight that those of us in the Seattle area acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, who are still here. It is a long tradition of the Duwamish tribe and others to gratefully honor the land that we share. And we want to honor them by joining them in that acknowledgement. If you're somewhere else, I'm also dropping into the chat a link to a map where you can find out whose land you're on. So quick logistics. We are recording, as the robot voice just told us. So you can watch this again in a few days, or tell your friends who couldn't be here tonight so they can watch it. As we go along, please put any questions you have in the Q&A, and I'll be passing it on to the panel. I'll turn it over now to Molly McElroy, the person responsible for this discussion happening at all. Molly?
Thank you, David. Welcome, everybody. I'm a former NSWA board member. And before I introduce our moderator, Jane, I wanted to give a little bit of background on how I basically came out of NSWA board member retirement to put this together. Probably like many of you, I've been thinking a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to build that work into my own work as a science communicator. That thinking made me want to reach out to media who are working in newsrooms who are doing this very thing. And that led me to the panelists that you see here today. It can be really hard to have these conversations. It takes a lot of vulnerability and honesty and thinking about ourselves and how we see the world, but it's so necessary. So I want to thank in advance our panelists and our moderator for being open and willing to talk about this with us. I want to thank NSWA for having the space to do this to begin with. And I also want to thank our audience for being here and contributing your thoughtful questions to the discussion that we're going to have. So let me introduce Jane. Many of you probably know her as a former NSWA president. She's a Seattle-based science writer and a regular contributor to Slate and High Country News. And she does so many other stories of her other outlets, such as the Smithsonian, Wired, and Undark. She recently taught science communication at the University of Washington. And she also has taught health journalism at SUNY Newmark School of Journalism. She serves on the boards of the National Association of Science Writers, the Open Notebook, and the Uproot Project, which is a new effort related to journalists who are journalists of color who are covering climate issues. That is a mouthful. We're going to put a link to that in the chat because it's new and I just heard about it, and I hope we all can learn more about it. So Jane, I'm going to turn it over to you. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much for organizing, Molly, and David and Enswa for hosting all of us. And thanks for everyone who's here tonight, or I guess who's going to listen to this later on. So I just wanted to give each of the panelists a chance to introduce themselves and say a little bit about who they are and what they do, so we don't just have like a recurring like introduction after introduction, and then you'll get to know everyone a little bit better. So Monica, would you like to go first?
Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Samayoa. I am an environment reporter with Oregon Public Broadcasting, and I like to focus my work on climate change and really just the human impact of it instead of just the science of it. I want to really report out how it affects people.
Thanks, Monica. We also have Isolde with us.
Hi there, I'm Isolde Raftery. I'm the online managing editor for KUOW Public Radio in Seattle, another radio person. And I think part of the reason Molly reached out to me to be on this panel is in the last year or so, I've been looking at Black history in Seattle and just looking at kind of the Seattle Foundation that way, just looking at historical stories, and been having just a ton of fun with those stories.
Thanks, Isolde. And last but not least, Michaeleen.
Hi, yes, I'm Michaeleen Doucleff, and I'm a global health correspondent at NPR in Washington. And I've been at NPR for 9 years, covering disease outbreaks before coronavirus, children's health, women's health. And I recently wrote a book about actually parenting around the world. And for about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years now, me and a lot of people on the science desk at NPR have been really trying to improve our diversity and inclusion in our stories in lots and lots of different ways. And I'm happy to talk about what we've done and where we still really need a lot of work. So it's something we've been really concentrating on and making an effort for, I'd say, like 5 or 6 years now.
That is actually a great segue into the first thing that I wanted to talk about to kick things off. I know that for me, I guess for further background, before I became a journalist, I was actually a scientist. And in the first few years of my career as a scientist and also as a journalist, I really didn't think too much about my identity or those of the people that I worked with or was reporting on and working with as particularly important. But over the years, I feel like I've developed just a much more acute awareness of who is and isn't included in a lot of science stories. So I'm curious to hear from you all, how does diversity, equity, and inclusion factor into your work now? And has that always been the case, or has that been kind of an evolution for you all?
I can go first if you want.
Go for it.
It's interesting because I feel like I kind of, so I come from a science background too. I have a PhD and I did a postdoc in NIH. And I feel like I started to really think about it while I was at NIH because I felt so excluded from the lab that I was in. I was one of the only few women and maybe 20 men. And I started to really see how their perception of me changed my opportunities, changed how I was thought of, what roles I played in the lab. And I thought coming into journalism that it would be better. And it actually has been better. Definitely it's been better. So when I got to NPR, we actually did an assessment of our stories, and it was really kind of abysmal, to be honest. Specifically the science desk was particularly bad. Very few women were our sources of science stories, and very, very few people of color. And we started this, like I said, 5 or 6 years ago, and it took a lot of effort to get people to change. It was this very slow process. And personally, I can speak for myself. I thought a lot about women specifically, but it wasn't until about 3 years ago where I started to really understand how important it is to include women of color in our stories, and how there are these kind of ideas in science and in science journalism that kind of actively leave them out, women, and particularly women of color. And it was actually an email from a woman, from a professor at the University of Santa Cruz, who kind of scolded me for not including the first author on as a source for a radio story. And I defended myself. I was like, well, you know, we're supposed to use the senior authors. And she's like, well, you're not giving credit to this, you know, this Latino woman that has done all the work. You know, you're just perpetuating this bias. And this email really shook me. And I was like, you know, she's right. I am perpetuating this bias by not including, you know, the first authors and making this real effort. And so since that point, I have really, that really changed me in a lot of ways. And I've really been kind of trying to, every time, you know, look and see who's done the work and try to include them. So the story, one of the story links I sent to you guys was this one we did recently, where I tried to interview the first author. He's a Chinese scientist, and I couldn't really interview him for the radio, but I included him and gave him credit in the story because it was really his work. But the rules at NPR and the rules of science writing would have left him out. So that's kind of my personal journey with it, as you want to say, you know, is that kind of seeing where the rules and the system kind of perpetuate some of the bias and perpetuate this non-inclusion and non-diversity, and how some, you know, we have to kind of think hard about them. I'll say one more thing and then I will be quiet. I have to say that once in the science desk, actually, so I work for the global health department, and once we really started expanding our sources, it was just this rich world out there that it was incredible. Like, we just were like, wow, there's all these ideas that even, you know, Western psychology and Western neuroscience doesn't really think about. And I just have to say that, like, what we have gotten in return has been incredible. And the information and the knowledge and the richness of the stories has just been so fantastic. So.
Yeah, and we'll come back. I feel like there's a lot there and would love to jump more into that in a bit. But yeah, Monica and Isolde, I'd also love to hear from you all about, you know, kind of your journey with this.
Well, before taking this job at OPB, I took a look at their work and their the reporters, and I mean, it's not a surprise that it is overwhelmingly white. And so my goal as a Latina myself, born and raised in the Bay Area, I was in this huge bubble of just diverse people, you know, everywhere. So my personal goal was to include the Latino community or other communities that weren't being reported, weren't being heard. Once I got started, I found that very difficult because a lot of professionals, a lot of people that I talked to were mainly white. So for me, it wasn't so much as like, it was difficult in a sense where it's hard to find people of color that are in these, you know, positions where you talk to them and, you know, the experts, right? But if you really try and you really want to talk with someone, it's possible. So for me personally, it wasn't something like, oh, I started it later in my career. It was just always something very self-conscious for myself, because I'm like, why am I not seeing people that look like me, or, you know, different perspectives from stories? So I still continue that, and I push others to do that as well in their work.
I love this question about our personal journey. And as you all have been talking, I've been thinking about it because it's not really one I've thought about much. But going back to 2004, I was a reporter in Skagit Valley up north. And I wasn't the primary reporter for tribes, but I covered immigration. And so I also covered the tribes. So you're looking at, I guess, at two different ends. But one of the main things I learned, and something I've applied to all my reporting, is just how So with the tribes, you don't call somebody up. You show up and you're willing to kind of hang out for a while. It's just a different style of communication than with, you know, say, I also covered education. So like the white superintendent who'd be like, I have 15 minutes and I'm going to be like answering things in terms of policy and not in terms of story, right? Like that was kind of a big thing. And so I quickly learned, like, you'd have both in the immigrant community and in the, and I mean, my personal background, I'm an immigrant, but it's a lot of through story and through storytelling, and that's how people kind of understand stories. And so that kind of became my own, I mean, I wouldn't say like a realization, but it definitely started informing how, you know, there is this way I kind of noticed, I hate to say like the white man way of looking at things, but where you talk about like policy and you're very much like this very like, you have 15 minutes to do a PowerPoint presentation, you definitely don't go over, or like at a city hall forum, you have 2 minutes to speak, well, like, or 5 minutes to speak. Well, that's not enough time to tell your story. And so that was kind of my background going into it. And then at KUOW in about, oh my God, I don't remember, was it 2014? We created like a racial, it was called the Racial Equity Team. And what was just around this idea of like, okay, well, how can we tell stories and really focus on stories, particularly about Black folks in Seattle, the experience of being Black in Seattle, but without making it always like kind of in relation to whiteness or like what bad white people have done and look how bad Black people's lives are. Like, it was like, I just felt in the media, there's this real awful dichotomy, or it was always, it just felt like white journalists are very, very comfortable with the kind of people of color are suffering narrative. And so that was what the Racial Equity Committee was really fighting against. And then I think I don't want to say we didn't really do very well on that. Not Racial Equity Committee. We have a Racial Equity Committee. It's a Racial Equity team, and then of reporters. And then we've kind of since then, our Racial Equity Committee, we've been really thinking about this a lot, has come up with a narrative screen. So we now have 4 questions that we ask for pretty much every story we do. And it's been really cool. I mean, I think everybody feels like it really helps their stories a lot. And I'd be happy to share some of those questions if people.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about specific things in a little bit, but I guess I want to zoom out just a little bit and talk about, so I feel like often in fields where people of a certain identity, whether that's, you know, race, gender, ability, are underrepresented, it sometimes feels really easy to default to sources who are well represented already. And I feel like each of you have kind of touched on that in a way, right? Like often there's a certain way we're used to doing our work as journalists. And there are certain people that are often most reachable in the framework of the way that we usually work. But I guess I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts to share about what is the overall impact of having homogenous sources? Like, what does that do to a story? And do you all have any strategies for how you are trying to cast a wider net, or things that you're thinking about as you're finding sources?
I'll jump in and say, I think every journalist should ask this question, and maybe we all do, but at the end of the interview, I say, who else should I talk to? That has always gotten me to, I don't want to say better people, but like better interviews where I'm like, oh, this really gets to what I'm trying to do for a story. I also spend a lot of time like looking around for different organizations, like the smaller nonprofits or the smaller, just making sure that I don't always go to the same source. And that has happened for a lot of stories. And, you know, I've talked about it with my editor, and most of the time it's because I'm working under a deadline and I know who to go to. And I'm like, I know they're going to give me what I need. But if I'm working on a feature story, I'm going to intentionally take my time to make sure that I'm talking to the right people and not just these larger organizations or nonprofits. Like, I want to talk to the people that are on the ground or that are actually out in the field and doing things. So that question really gets me to a wider sense of who else should be included in the story.
For sure.
I'd love to give the example of my coworker, Ashley Horuko, who somewhat covers prisons. And the way she covers prisons is never through, you'll never have her calling the public information officer for the prisons, for the Department of Corrections. And I mean, she will for their comment, but that's not how she accesses a story. And it's because she's done a ton of groundwork with all the families of prisoners. She's met a bunch of the teachers. And this is like a minor subbeat that she has, but she just has a Rolodex of prisoners. And the way she conducts these interviews is she begins with incarcerated people. And I think that's a fantastic way to go about it. And I know for me personally, like I find it very easy to go through the FLACs at first, like the public information officers. That's very easy. And oftentimes that is the way to do it, but it's not going to be, well, what Ashley's done is, as a result, we have many more voices in our stories of the people who are actually incarcerated. And you don't end up stuck with just policy stories, which is very easy.
I can say a little bit about some of the things that have helped. One thing that has really helped me, and I think our team, is to look at where the research was done. If there's like samples or patients or even collaborators and in different parts of the world, different communities are involved, then you want to have somebody from each of those places as a voice, right? Because they're contributors to that research. I think the other thing that I've really come to realize, and I mean, this has been really well documented, but I think it's something that hasn't been fixed in psychology and some of the more behavioral sciences, and it's something that definitely science writing still kind of echoes, and that's just how white psychology is. So like, there's been lots of papers written on this. Like 10 years ago, there was a big flurry of them, but still today, you pick up a psychology paper and 9 times out of 10, it is written from the white Western perspective. And if you're not conscious of that and go and ask somebody who's studying the same topic not from that perspective, then you will just continue this very narrow view of like the human mind and the human psyche. And I think it's that questioning, like who is this perspective from? And who is, and if it's not being named, which it's not a lot in psychology, then kind of seeding that down in your mind. I'm thinking right now, I'm working on a story about joy and positive emotions, and 90% of what's out there is all from the white Western perspective. And it is very different in the Asian communities, Latino communities, and bringing that in makes the story so much better and so much more interesting and so much more accurate, right? Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Not only white participants, but often specifically white college kids who are ages like 18 to 24.
Exactly, and like middle class, right? That's like a class, age, and right. It's this tiny, tiny view of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to go back to this idea that I feel like Monica and Isolde both touched on in what you all just said. And I feel like the underlying thread in trying to like build out these sources and just make these connections is trust. And I'm wondering if you all can say a little bit about that source building, that process of building your sources on a beat and just trying to connect with folks.
So I recently wrote about Southern Oregon's wildfire survivors, but really focused on the Latino community because they were really hit the hardest. And this story took a very long time because it kept taking me in different directions. I knew when I first started out that I wanted to do a check-in, right? I'm like 6 months. And I think it came out like at 8 months after, but I started the story like almost at the 6-month mark from the Labor Day fires that happened. And I wasn't hearing back from a lot of people. And what I was learning and what I have heard before when I reach out to nonprofits in the Latino community is they're like, who are you? Like, why are you coming in here all of a sudden? Why do you all of a sudden care about us? And I was like, oh my gosh, it was so hard because I'm still new. You know, I moved to Portland in July 2019. And then all of a sudden, you know, there's a pandemic and I'm at home. And so that really halted how I was building relationships with a lot of organizations. So through that, it was really hard to talk with them and share their time. But I learned that it takes a few more interviews or a few more days and whatnot to really learn like who they are, let them know what your intentions are. And I always tell my sources, especially from the Latino community, that I'm not here to just kind of drop in and disappear. Like, here's my contact info. Call me if you need anything, like tell me if you see something. And when it came to talking with wildfire survivors, that was actually the most difficult part, because a lot of the organizations were protecting them because they didn't want reporters to just kind of come in and talk to them, get their story and be like, oh my God, I got this like juicy story. Because as reporters, that's how we think, right? The more tragic something is, you're like, oh, it's a better story. And unfortunately, it's terrible, but it's what we have to do and tell people's story. And so when I finally got through with UNETE, which is an organization in Southern Oregon, they're like, I can connect you to wildfire survivors, but I'm letting you know it's difficult. You know, it's going to be hard. And right after the interview, I mean, both of the wildfire survivors I spoke with are crying throughout this interview, and I'm just like holding it together. I'm like, oh my God, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. Let it all out right after the interview, and it's just kind of, it really reminded me to like, I need to keep building these relationships. I need to let them know they can trust me, and I need to let them know that I'm not just using them for a story. And, you know, till this day, I still check in with them. Like, how are you doing? What's going on? One of my sources is still struggling to find a place to live. Another one has moved for the 5th time now, or 6th time. So it's hard, but in the end, you know, you're making all these different connections. You're building this relationship where down the line, if something else happens, especially right now, we're in a drought. There's an extreme heat wave coming this weekend, and I'm just so worried that things are going to start getting a lot worse earlier in the year. And at least if that happens, I'm already connected in that. In Southern Oregon, I should say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And while we're talking about this piece, by the way, I think our hosts can probably link to it. You all should all go read Monica's piece. It's great. So you point out in the piece that Latino communities in Oregon were hit particularly hard by these wildfires. And sometimes people can face an additional barrier if English isn't their first language, if you have to apply for aid in English. I guess I'm curious if you can also say, like you just mentioned, you know, this whole process of source building, but also what brought you to that story? Like, how do you typically find and think about angles? Because that's, you know, like I've seen a ton of wildfire stories. I, in fact, also was working on a wildfire story over the pandemic and also definitely cried on some of my phone calls because it's really hard to hear those stories. But, you know, your piece talks about a community that I don't feel like is always talked about in wildfire stories. So I'm wondering if you can just say a little bit about how you found that angle.
Well, thank you for reading it. And I really appreciate that. I worked really hard to make sure that the Latino community voice, or just what was going on in that community, was just highlighted and say, look, this is still happening 6-8 months after, you know. I think, like I mentioned before, like the story was taking me a lot of different turns and twists into figuring out like what's the story here. And as I was talking to different organizations, I was kind of like, oh, hey, here's United Way. They have this fund that just basically says, here's money, take it. And what really kind of put me on track was an article that April Ehrlich from JPR wrote about FEMA denying 14,000 applications for assistance in Southern Oregon. And I'm like, what? What do you mean denying 14,000 people? And that's when I started taking a closer look into like what's really happening here. And that's kind of how I went down this path.
That's great. I also wanted to switch gears and focus on a piece of Isolde's that I recently read. So I kind of want to open this up to Isolde and Michaeleen. So how do you approach covering a marginalized community if you don't belong to it? What made me think of this is Isolde's piece on public comment from parents to Seattle Public Schools after teachers wore Black Lives Matter shirts. This was back in 2016, I think.
A long time ago, but yeah, that story keeps coming up.
Yeah, and I mean, I thought it was really interesting because you framed it in terms of understanding white liberal racism, which I think as many of us living in the Pacific Northwest, we're familiar with this particular brand of racism. I'm just wondering, yeah, like what led you to that story? And I guess for all of you, what power do you feel white people might have in journalism to address the issues of race in particular?
So that story was about parents at Laurelhurst Elementary, which is a very, it's probably one of the wealthiest school in terms of the neighborhood it lives in. Incidentally, right next to where my dad lives. So he was deeply displeased with my story. Yeah, we'd gotten reports about like, oh, these parents were really upset about the school having a Black Lives Matter day where the kids were encouraged to wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts. And every single parent I called was really unwilling to talk. And then I was like, what do white parents do? And having grown up, frankly, in that community and recalling like how a lot of the more closed-minded people treated my family when we first arrived, I kind of thought like, I'm gonna put on my white lady hat. How will they do it? And it's like, well, that'll be stern, angry emails because they don't want the confrontation, but it'll be the angry emails. And what they don't realize is those are public record. And so I did a public records request for every single email from this day to this day with the word Black Lives Matter, BLM, or a whole host of things. Actually, no, I requested all the principals' emails and every email to like the board anyway. Like there were a lot of them and the parents were terrible. And it was wonderful. It's like what you said, Monica, like you don't want to dance on anybody's grave, right? Like that terrible, like, oh yes, this is a great tragedy. But I definitely, I will say there were some emails that were so terrible, I actually didn't even include them because I kind of realized it would actually be painful to read, for people to read. But that was very much coming at it through what did these parents say? And also Seattle is so proud of itself that I wanted to kind of, for being progressive, I really wanted to point out like, wait, this element exists. People talk like this privately. But my struggle there was like, how far could I go? Could I put the most racist emails in? And I decided ultimately not to. So I kind of kept it in the middle. But you were kind of asking about it in terms of how to, I mean, it wasn't a story where I interviewed some parents, Black parents who had students in the school, but that really wasn't it. I mean, it was more interviewing white people about their racism, which is funny. That isn't something we do as journalists. We don't usually prod our own racism or other people's racism, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of interesting observation in itself, is that I feel like whenever we're talking about DEI related things, I think people always think to like interview a person of color about what they think about racism. And usually that person is like, it is bad. But it's kind of interesting to get white people's perspective on race, or especially in this unfiltered way where you're seeing what they're saying in what they believe is a private email. And you did some lovely analysis of just kind of, you know, what that might mean. But yeah, I guess, you know, we've talked a little bit already about how journalism, well, science in particular, but also science journalism are particularly white. And I would also venture that, you know, in positions of power, I know men are overrepresented. You know, people who are abled are definitely overrepresented, especially in upper leadership. And I just wanted to ask, like, have you all ever faced any kind of pushback for trying to think about DEI more in your stories? And if so, how did you push back on that? Or did you push back on it? I know sometimes there's not always space to.
I could speak on that. There have been a few instances where I want to include more Spanish-speaking voices into my articles and or have them, you know, translated. But that's still something that, you know, unfortunately, OPB is still trying to work on as a structure for it. That's kind of like, you know, my next goal within the organization. You know, I'm going to fight until I can't fight anymore into, you know, having our articles and our work in different languages, not just Spanish. Because if we're really going to tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion within our organization, that has to be, you know, one of the major fixes that or issues that needs to be resolved. If we really want to include everybody, you know, like not just continue to focus on, and I think this has been mentioned in articles and stuff that, you know, NPR's very white audience, right? No longer just catering to them, but just start to open up to different communities. So, yeah.
I mean, I can echo that. I remember when I first started off in radio, it was made very clear to me that, you know, accents are bad, whatever that means. Accents, meaning, you know, particular accents, and that you don't want to use too much of another language. And even to this day, that is a very, very strong policy at NPR, at least in my experience. I don't know if that's shifting, but you can think about what that says and what that does and how that restricts you. And yeah, I don't know how to fight that, to be honest. I'm trying, but it feels like it feels like it comes from very far up, you know. But Monica, if you have some ideas for me to try to fight that, I would love it. And you're making me want to fight it more. But
We could talk after. We could talk.
Oh, it's funny in Europe, they use other languages all the time on air, on TV, and they have it's dubbed and the person's voice goes down. And I feel like that was happening all the time on NPR, and you just don't hear it anymore.
I mean, there's been, like, since I've been there, and I've been on the radio now 7, 8 years. I mean, it's something that actively gets told to you, like, you don't want too much, you can't have too much, you know. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. There's people say, you know, like, if there's too heavy of an accent, whatever that means, again, like, you know, then you can't understand the person, or just cut it short. Or, I mean, these are things I hear all the time. Yeah, I don't know. I will say that in terms of the pushback, I feel like some of the pushback I've gotten is from colleagues that just don't want to change, to be honest. And it's really frustrating, you know. And it's like one time I even suggested, somebody asked me to edit or look over somebody's piece, and I said, it was a piece about anger. And I said, well, maybe you should ask a Black woman psychologist or psychiatrist about this question, you know, just get her feedback on this. And that reporter will still not talk to me today. Yeah, I'm not kidding you. I mean, it is seriously like some resistance on certain parts, I feel like.
Why won't they talk to you? Like,
I mean, they were just so very like kind of upset that I should make a suggestion that like what they were saying was not representative of, you know, I mean, these are science reporters, right? They think that they're representing the truth and facts, and me saying that was suggesting that what they were saying was wrong. And I wasn't saying it was wrong. I just thought it was coming from a certain perspective, right? And I don't know, they took very big offense about it.
Yeah, I feel like it can be hard to try and enact change, especially on an institutional level. But I guess maybe the flip of that, Isolde, you mentioned KUOW has some screening questions that you all feel like have been working really well for you all. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that. And also, Monica and Michaeleen, feel free to jump in if you all have found anything in your workplaces that has actually been helpful to try and get people to think about DEI issues.
Yeah, I first don't want to make it seem like KUOW is some sort of utopia. We screw up all the time, and we get called out for it. So that's good. We actually, it's funny, really appreciate getting called out. I know that sounds weird, but like that's really how you learn. I've actually told people, just like as a, when I consider like how things have changed, a small thing, in 2013, NPR, and therefore also KUOW and maybe OPB as well, wouldn't let people use their preferred gender. It was the gender assigned at birth that had to be used. And this was a problem with Chelsea Manning being previously named Bradley Manning. But like, if you think about how far we've come, so I mean, we're learning so much right now, and we do change. And so yeah, the reporter who can't take input is like how are you going to survive in this industry? Like, you're going to be irrelevant in like 6 months if that's how. But KUOW screening questions, yeah. So and this is actually like talk about like issues of resistance, is we have this racial equity team. They came up with the narrative screen for the newsroom. And I started using it thinking it was the final draft, and then apparently it wasn't. And it was pretty good, except that it was kind of like, the questions were basically, it like felt like by the end, if you answered, yes, I've included a white person in the story, like think about it real hard. And so like those questions they were kind of problematic, because it was like not exactly how we're supposed to think about stories. So they went back to the drawing board, credit where credit's due. And they worked with more people in the newsroom, and they came up with, so we have foundational questions that we ask, and we don't ask these as often, but we look, one of my favorite questions, and this is like, what racist stereotypes or implicit biases might be activated when audiences consume this story? So like how might you think about that out the gate? How can the story highlight policy and other solutions led by communities of color? I really like that question, because that gets at the like, are you about to do a white savior story? And then there's like, those are the two bottom ones, but the first two that you're supposed to answer, that we do answer, is which communities of color are most affected, and be as specific as you can in terms of race and geography, and how will their voices be centered in the story? And then the number one question we have, is there an opportunity to explore institutional racial equities, past and present, as opposed to individual attitudes and behaviors? So you're not just kind of making it a she said, and this happened, you're actually like digging in. And the question there is like, okay, I mean, go ask people the deeper question, like, what does this represent? What's the bigger story behind this? And everybody who's done this screen is really pleased with the results and how they think about a story. It changes how they think about the story.
That's great. I was gonna
every
ask,
time, but like it, when we do, we're usually pretty happy with it. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, not to put you too much on the spot, but has there ever been a time that you can think of that you used that screen and that it actually changed the way that you thought about approaching a story, or that was just kind of a gut check on something you weren't sure about?
Yes, yes. There was a story I ultimately recused myself on because I realized I couldn't tell the story because of that screen. It was a story about inequities in maternal health between during COVID, Black women during COVID. I was just like, I feel like the person who needs to write this story or edit it needs to be, we need either the editor or the writer needs to be a Black woman who has had children. Like, I just felt like this is not going to work. We can't have two white ladies on this story. And I don't really know what, but also you don't want to be in this place where you ultimately then don't do a story because you're like, oh, well, there's no person of color to do the story, so it doesn't get done. You don't want that either. But the narrative screen, it showed me kind of how in over my head I was with the story. And I thought, I have too much work to do to get to a place where I could edit this properly.
That's a great way of putting it.
Decision again, but like, it was the decision I made at that time.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think what you're getting at with that catch-22 of like, well, we can't just not do the story because we don't have enough people of color in the newsroom. I feel like that often is a self-perpetuating thing, right? Where we don't do the stories because we don't have the people, but then we also don't end up getting the people if we aren't doing the stories. Yeah, so I also, so I'm gonna ask one more question, but then I would like to open it up to audience questions. So if you all have any questions, please go into that Q&A and put them there. But I wanted to point out that this is a panel of journalists. So we're obviously coming at this from the journalist perspective and journalism newsrooms, particularly audio journalism, it turns out. But NSWA, you know, there's a wide range of folks who are in NSWA. Not everyone's working directly in journalism. And so I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts for folks who work in science communication or academia more broadly about how their work might elevate stories from marginalized communities, or how, you know, this pathway of SciComm or academia into science journalism in particular might, you know, might work if there's something that there's might help that kind of workflow.
I mean, if I had my druthers, I would say, like, you know, somebody that works at a university in the communications, like taking an effort to train, you know, a diverse group of people to talk to the media would be amazing. I know that that's asking a lot, but like, because there are, like we said, like I think somebody said earlier, you know, we have these people that we go to over and over again. It's because they sound good and they know how to answer the questions and they know what we need and they know like a sound bite and but that's all trainable, right? That's not a gift or a talent. And you know, I would do it. I'd go in there and just like, this is what we want, you know, it would be fantastic. Younger people, more people of color. I mean, everything that we've been talking about, if they're, you know, because it comes from experience too, right? And that and like you say, if we don't give them experience, they're not going to get the experience. So
I totally agree. And I'm someone that does not come from a science background. So sometimes I have to, like, here's a study, Monica, can you just story it? I'm reading, I'm like, what does this paragraph mean? Like, what did I just read? And so, you know, I think training people, you know, to kind of talk to us like how you talk to your friend. That's always what my editor tells me, is like, write your story like you're talking to your friend. And especially with, you know, research and studies, it's very hard because you're reading like all the technical stuff and I'm like, but what? So I would say just kind of communicating better in a way where everyone's going to understand, not just the scientists.
I mean, we can also just open it up to any last tips you all have for folks in thinking about DEI, or really anything I didn't ask you all about that you all have been thinking about related to this.
I just wanted to add, don't be afraid to kick the door down or use both feet to kick the door down. This past year, a lot of newsrooms have really been, looking in the mirror and like, what are we doing here? And the Black, Indigenous, and journalists of color at OPB got together last year and, wrote a letter to the VPs at OPB and we're like, look, these things are not right. We need you to fix them. And, at first they were pretty shocked about it because we weren't nice anymore. There's a lot of times where you just, you keep asking, you keep saying things, and they're like, oh, okay. When we had this meeting, we were just direct. And we said, these are what we would like for OPP to do, especially if we're, an organization that's proudly saying, oh, we're working on our, diversity, equity, inclusion practices. So, when you do get pushed back, don't be afraid to push back. They're probably going to be upset, and that's okay. But, a lot of the times when these tough conversations happened, a week later, they would get back to me and be like, you know what? I thought about it and you were right. So just kind of, not being afraid. And if you're of the dominant cast, I would say, you'd be surprised of how much more power your voice has over a person of color. So, if you really want to be an ally, just speak up and just, say like, hey, you know what, that probably doesn't sound right. Or, you should probably listen to Monica, like she's probably correct. Or, so just kind of speak up and just don't be afraid.
Absolutely. Isolde, Michaeleen, any thoughts on what you might recommend?
I mean, I can tell you in the last 5 years, I've learned that collaboration is so important. You ask about like working in a group that you're not part of, and I have so many people in the communities I've reported on that have taught me, and I try to listen. And the woman that scolded me that I was talking about earlier, the white woman that scolded me, she wrote in that same email, Michaeleen will listen to you. And I think that really had a profound impact because it was like, yeah, I want to listen, I want to learn. And what they've taught me is like, collaboration is important. And that means coming back to them after you've written a story and checking in and being like, is this right? Did I get it right? And even sending, like, there's people I send the whole stories to because I want to make sure I've gotten it right, everything right. And I know that's, again, a journalism no-no, right? Like I've been taught otherwise, but again, it's something that if we're part of the change and changing the narrative, then the narrative has to be right. And I can't say that, but the people in the community can help me with that, right? And that's one of the things I try to collaborate as much as possible. And like, it's not just like I get the information and write the story, like Monica was saying. It's like I get the information, I write the story, and I go back, and I go back again, and I go back again, and I'm always making it better. Always getting better at it. It's never perfect.
I was gonna say that like I echo that. I share my stories now. I mean, I remember when I was much younger, people would say, like, editors would be like, you'll get fired. I mean, I had my story edited by a Black historian in Seattle, and I just made that call because, like, I thought, well, who better than to edit this story? This was a different story from a long time ago, but I absolutely have just started sharing my stories with people, and like straight up have done Google Docs with people where I'm like, go ahead, edit away. And the rule is you're not going to take every edit, but there are little tiny little things that people will bring up and be like, I don't like that. And I tell them like, edit for tone, edit. I don't say edit because I don't really want them to think, but please read for tone, read for facts, obviously. And that has surprised me. Like, if you had told me 10 years ago I'd be doing that, I would have been like, oh, Keller horror, you know, it's so bad, don't do that. But it's great. And I feel like stories are so much richer too. Because then, Michaeleen, you've probably noticed this too. People are like, you know what? That also reminds me of this other thing. So that's cool too.
Yeah, I heard from an increasing number of journalists that this is something that they do, and they always confess it. like we're not supposed to, because journalistically, but it really just depends on the story, right? I feel like many things, it's a judgment call whether that's going to improve the story. And like you said, it's not always like you're going to take every edit. And kind of along the same lines, I wanted to just put the idea out there of what a sensitivity reader is. And I think that might be one of the links that just got dropped into the chat. I feel like sensitivity reading has been more popular historically in fiction circles, where folks would read like a full novel, and someone from a community that was represented in that novel would read it through just kind of as a gut check. And I feel like this is gaining a little bit of traction in journalism as well, where it's almost like paying a fact checker fee, where you get someone to read something over and is like, okay, well, clearly you're one person, you can't know everything, but just based on your lived experience and knowledge of this community, is there anything that is like a red flag here? Like, or is the framing completely wrong or insulting? So I think one of the links in the chat might be, there's an open notebook piece that I wrote about this, if people are interested in that. I feel like especially if you work for an institution that's not necessarily a journalism outlet. I know some journalism outlets are paying people for that now, but if you come from an institution that has funds for such things and you're working on a project that might benefit from a reader, thought I would mention it. It looks like we have some questions in the chat. Someone says, can you expand more on how to work with communities that you don't directly identify with in a way that situates the community members as experts? It's a great question.
I think that goes into, you know, building that relationship first, and asking yourself, you know, why haven't you gone to this person before? You know, it's tough even for, you know, for example, like I struggled when I try to go into my own community here in Oregon, and, you know, I was like this outsider, and I'm like, but I'm one of y'all. So it's just really, it's going to be uncomfortable no matter what, you know. Even as journalists, we've always like, oh my God, you know, when we first started, I had to go talk to somebody. I would just say, like, you know, just there any other person you go talk to, be like, oh, okay, hi, you know. It's all about that, building that relationship, and just not being afraid to get uncomfortable. That's really just it.
I can tell you something that I always think, I listen to the people in the community that are revered, right, and held up, and I ask who is the elder, who is the person to go to. And when I was up in Alaska, I will always remember one of the women told me, they said, well, you could learn about our culture. And she said, she tells white people this, well, you could read about the Inuits, and she says, white people just look at her like, what? And so I feel like, you know, when I go somewhere out of the country or somewhere, you know, I read about the place and I learn about the culture as much as I can. And then I listen, you know, I really listen, because I think we have this idea that we're experts, and we are experts in a lot of categories, but we're not experts in other people's lives and other people's communities. And that's why you're there, to learn. So for me, it's about learning and listening. And then, like I said, like collaboration and valuing the information the same, right? Putting the information on the same, yes, that's my daughter, sorry. Putting the information on the same level, right? Like the information from each source is valued the same,
Definitely.
or even
Yeah.
valued more. even valued more.
Showing through action that someone is the expert. Absolutely. Okay, last question. Are there other rules in journalism that should be modified, like accents on air or edits from sources?
I mean, I brought up the one idea where like we only interview the senior authors, or we only interview the main person or one person from the study. I'm really trying to interview the people that do the work and give credit. That's another thing that I've heard from my collaborations, is how, you know, somebody was like, well, why do you only name one person who did the study? Why aren't you giving these other people credit? And I'm like, well, that's just what I'm told to do. I can only name one person on the radio, and it's kind of weird, right? Like, but all these other people were involved. I'm trying to think of there are a lot, but I mean, I think it's also about who's one of the, at NPR, we have this wonderful, like diversity coach that they've hired. She's fantastic. And she talks a lot about like who in the room gets to talk and who in the room gets to be believed. And I've thought about that a lot. Like, and I think you can think about that in your pieces and also in your reporting, like who gets to talk and who are you believing and who are you valuing the information from? So I think about that a lot.
Monica, I saw that you had unmuted. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but don't know if you had anything to add.
No, this question is actually making me think like deep thought, because accents on air, obviously like it shouldn't matter. But then I kind of think about the work that I've done at OPB so far, and I've probably broken a lot of what would have been their rules. I'm putting Spanish voices on the air. And it's just, for example, like getting edits from sources. I wrote a story about how, Black Oregonians aren't able to enjoy the outdoors the same way as white people. And my editor is white. I'm Latina. I'm not Black, but I do have experience of feeling othered. And when I worked on that story, I made sure I kept going back to my source and saying, "Is this what you meant? Is this because?" That's not a story that I want to mess up. That's not a story I want to get emails. Like, that's not what I said. So, those two examples that are up there are ones that I probably break, but that's because I want the industry to change. So that's just me being a rebel in my own sense.
Isolde, any closing thoughts?
No, but I'm definitely going to ask my team what rules we should be breaking, because I bet they've thought about it. I'm in management, right? So like maybe I'm actually imposing rules that they want to break. So I'm going to be asking my team that. So thank you for asking the question, whoever asked that question.
I think that was Molly. Yeah, no, I love the framing of it to a team, because I feel like it makes it a little bit more exciting to be like, what rules should we break, instead of like, what new policy should we instate to, anyway. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight and sharing your insights. It was a real joy to talk with you all. I'm going to throw it back to David now.
Hello, here we are. And I want to add my thanks to the panelists and to Jane and to Molly for getting this all together, and to all of you for joining us. Things to remember as we go: if you're not an NSWA member, please join. And whether you're a member or not, go to the website, nwscience.org, and find out, in case you haven't been paying attention, all the cool things that have been happening and are going to be happening, including the recording of this evening in a couple of days. So good night. And again, thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Well, there we, oops. Stop the recording.